All right, welcome back. It is 23 March. This is the JFK Assassination Audit video number 72. We're going through the David Atlee Phillips testimony about his CIA station in Mexico City. We're eventually going to get Oswald into Mexico City here, but we're doing the setup. So we're doing the testimony of David Atlee Phillips before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and we'll just get right into it. It says, Mr. Sprague, how long was it at best you can recall that Mr. Piccola remained in that assignment until he was replaced by Mr. Shaw? Oh, interesting. I'm sure that Mr. Shaw was there all the time and was there when I left, and I believe Mr. Piccola was there and left sometime when I was chief and was replaced by Mr. Redacted, but I cannot remember when. But they were not there simultaneously. Mr. Sprague, was there anybody else on the assignment in the Cuban station under you other than the people that you have mentioned during the time that was your assignment? There was a secretary, I believe, we shared with some other offices. What was her name? I don't recall. Do you have any recollection as to the nickname, first name, last name? Not at the moment, sir. Now, would you first just explain to us the way in which the operation worked? The Cuban embassy had in it diplomats, intelligence officers, consular officers. We had priorities. The intelligence officers, for instance, were at the top of the list, and the senior diplomats, and we tried to obtain information in every way that we could. And so, since every embassy, the intelligence officers always go in under diplomatic cover, one may be signed up as the janitor. One may be signed up as the, visa secretary. So they're not going to have on their application for that host government that, this is our intelligence espionage officer. They're not going to say that. So it's up to our guys, our intelligence guys, to figure out who their intelligence guys are. And basically it's just a matter of deduction on that. This would be another reason that since he became head of the Cuban side of the CIA in Mexico City, that you would want to send in someone like Oswald to shake up things, and then they would report back through their intelligence officers back to the Cubans, to the Russians, to the KGB. All that traffic would be, from different people, and they would have the access to read that, through wiretapping, telephone tapping, communications, radio traffic tapping, telex tapping, satellites, all these things. So how you find it, if you don't know who those people are, and it's your job to monitor them, what do? Well, you want to find out who those people are. So how do you find out those people are? You send in a runner like Oswald to go in there, act crazy, shake up things, get people talking, because if Oswald just goes in and says, I'd just like a visa to Cuba so I can go sit on the beach. No. That's not going to work. If he goes in and screaming and shouting, and I think he even brought a gun, they're going to remember that, and they're going to type that up. That's going to be very, very unusual. They're going to report that back. Who is this Oswald guy? Because the Cubans don't know who the hell Oswald is. But they're going to report back to the Cubans intelligence. Cuban intelligence is going to be speaking with, Russian Soviet intelligence. And then they're going to put back that, hey, that guy Oswald is the same guy who defected to Russia, what would be 4 years before. And he lived in Russia for 2 years, but then he went back to the United States. And now you're telling us that he's trying to get back into Russia, and then that's going to come back down the chain the opposite way. Instead of going up, it's going to come back down through intelligence into Cuba to their intelligence officers there, and then they're going to send that back to their intelligence officers in the Cuban embassy. All the while, the NSA, the CIA, they're all going to be watching and listening. And then that's the way you figure out who's the boss, who's in charge, the hierarchy, because you don't know. It's not like they put out a list. You have to make it yourself. Okay? That's how you figure out the hierarchy. And I believe that's one of the things, besides setting up Oswald to come across as this crazy person, okay, that eventually would kill the president. See, here's the thing. Oswald doesn't know that this is like late September, October. He doesn't know that October, November, 2 months from now, this same organization that Phillips is working with is going to set him up for the murder of the President of the United States. All he knows is he's been given an assignment. Hey, go do this today. Just like his assignment was to go to Clinton. And he had his handlers there, because he's not very smart in handling himself. And then he had Godot, handled him and helped him get the visa. And then he had, this guy, what was his name? Alex, this English guy, accompanied him on the bus down to Mexico City. Oswald needed a handler. Okay? Oswald's handler for Mexico City, the operation, was David Atlee Phillips. This is why he was written about. This is why he had to sue these companies, because when you look at the evidence, it points to David Atlee Phillips was the handler for Oswald. That Oswald sent him down, that Phillips sent him down there on an assignment. No one has been able to figure out what the assignment was, just to make him look crazy. No, it was also to shake up things so they could get the traffic going up and down the line from Mexico City to Cuba, or Mexico City to Havana, to Moscow, to Havana, to Mexico City, to figure out the chain of command of who was in charge in the intelligence right there. So that's how you do it. It's just like we got these memos here, these FBI memos. Here, I'll show you one. Hold on 1 second. All right, so this is what we'll use this as an example. This is about Godot. Okay, this is an FBI memo. Okay, you see it says United States government to the director of the FBI. That's his routing number, I guess you could say. Here is a special agent in charge of WFO. I'm not sure who that would be. They would know who that is. And then here's the subject. Now, a lot of these sometimes would have like CC to include other people. They're going to have names of agents here. And this is exactly what another intelligence agency would be doing. Okay? So the Cubans are going to have a memo, a memorandum, a telex, a cable, whatever. In Mexico City, they don't know who Oswald is. They're going to send back to their intelligence headquarters in Havana, and it's going to go to their director, and it's going to be from the embassy, the head of the intelligence embassy in Mexico City. Okay, and the subject's going to be Lee Oswald at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. And they're going to state what happened. This American came in, said that he's sympathetic. He's showed us a membership card of Free Play for Cuba. Said he had lived in Russia. We don't know who the hell he is. He's trying to get a visa to get into Cuba and to get into Russia. Can you please find out more information about him? So, keyword's going to be Russia right there. He said he went to Russia. You see, now, Oswald could have gone, okay, to the Cuban embassy and never, ever, ever mention that he had lived in Russia before. Okay? Never. Okay? But he specifically says that out loud. He specifically says and shows his membership card to the Free Play for Cuba because he's trying to build his legend show his what do you call it, his affidavit, his bona fides. Okay, hey, I'm with one of you, and just let me in, and da 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 da. Okay, but God knows why you got to get into Cuba so you can transfer on into Russia. Why not just go to Russia directly? Anyway, the whole reason, of course, it doesn't make any sense. They try to use it in the Warren Commission, showing that, oh, well, Oswald was trying to get into Cuba, okay, so he could get into Russia, okay, so he could, and they do this weird logic, he could come back and kill the president 2 months later. Which, if you don't really sit down and think about it, you're like, oh, yeah, okay, I mean, he's a communist, and he's trying to get into Cuba, and he's trying to get into Russia, so he can come back and kill the president. Yeah, that makes sense. No, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense at all if he's going to be the assassin of the President of the United States. It doesn't make any sense at all. Think about it. The only reason it makes sense is because they're trying to paint him as this crazy, Marxist-Leninist wannabe who's trying to get into Russia. And if he's this crazy Marxist-Leninist that hates America, why didn't he just stay in Russia before? They don't answer that one either. It only makes sense, again, if you're trying to paint him as being this crazy person, a Marxist-Leninist, and also, you get a 2-for-1 bang with this patsy. If he goes in, shakes up the people that are there, it runs back and forth between Havana, Moscow, Havana, Mexico City, and then you can see, just like with these memos, they can look at and see and confirm who is doing what and who's in charge of what, okay? Because even though it's probably coded, they probably broken the codes. Okay, the NSA has probably broken the codes. So that's what they're looking for. They're looking for to find out the chain of command, okay, of this Cuban embassy. Because this Cuban embassy is fairly new, okay, because the revolution just happened, 3-4 years before. So they still don't know exactly who's in charge. And then if you read what David Atlee Phillips says in his testimony. Hold on one second. Okay, so it says right here on page 10 at historymatters.com, David Atlee Phillips, 11/27/76, his testimony for the House Select Assassinations Committee. He tells you right there, he says, and would you explain what the nature of your new assignment was, which, as I take it, then had for the remainder of your tour in Mexico? It was to know what the Cubans were doing in Mexico City, specifically in their embassy, to try to obtain as much information as possible about their intentions in Mexico and Latin America, specifically to know what was going on in and around the Cuban embassy. Okay. Now he says that, but he also says this. And he's talking about the chain of command there. Hold on one second. Now he says here. Now, this is on page 13. He says, now would you first just explain to us the way in which your operation worked? The Cuban embassy had in it diplomats, intelligence officers, consular officers. We had priorities. The intelligence officers, for instance, were at the top of the list, and the senior diplomats, and we tried to obtain information in every way that we could. That was by using the traditional techniques of espionage, which included, when you can, have an agent in place inside, which included knowledge and what was said on the telephone, which includes knowledge of correspondence, and having people who worked for you who have reason to go in at those embassies and make observations, that sort of thing. So what they're talking about is they've got moles they're trying to recruit moles inside the Cuban embassy. And how do you do that? Well, first you can actively place moles inside the Cuban embassy, and you do that by, say, the Cubans, they hire a new secretary, or they hire a new typist, or they hire a cleaning service to come in and clean at night. So you either want to put in your own guys doing that, or you want to recruit people like in the cleaning business or secretaries to go apply for that job, or you want to find out who those people are that are already there, find out where they live, follow them, get to know the routine, and either convince them, either patriotic duty, money, or coercion. It's called compromat. Either get in with drug. It's the same old things: drugs, money, or sex. You compromise them into working for you. That's usually the best way, because you got a hook on them. Okay? Any other way, they can always just bow out and say, I don't want to do this no more. So that's what he's talking about. So you get those people in place. You've got human intelligence inside the embassy. You've got probably electronic surveillance intelligence coming from the embassy. You've got NSA tapping of their communications, or radio, telex, telephone communications. And then people are translating that, monitoring and translating it. You've got visual visual espionage, people outside the embassy taking pictures, following people around in cars, things like that. And then there's another form, is you send in, I don't know what the intelligence term would be for it, but you send in a ringer, I would call him, a bomb that goes off, and that's Oswald. You send him in, tell him to act crazy, tell him to act desperate. Maybe he is desperate. Maybe you tell him, hey, if you can get a visa, Oswald will give you an extra bonus, so he becomes desperate. Any way you can, you're going to hit that embassy with multiple layers of types of intelligence that you can pull from that and find out what's going on. You're not just going to use, some guy sitting outside with a camera. You're not just going to use some cleaning lady. You're going to have multiple moles inside the embassy. You're going to have multiple turned agents. Okay? So there's going to be various different levels. And then another way is to just roll in a barrel bomb like Oswald. Roll him into the embassy, have it blow up, and then sit back and monitor what happens. You got your moles inside that report back, there was this crazy guy. He came in, he was screaming and yelling. He even had a gun one time. He wanted to get into Cuba so he could get into Russia. And he was a nut. He was crazy. Okay? It's just a performance. It's like Tom Cruise jumping on the couch in front of, Oprah Winfrey show. It's an act to cause a response. Okay? You got communication, radio traffic, telephone traffic going out. You're monitoring about this incident. Okay? And then from that, you can build a list of intelligence officers that would be in charge of certain, and know the areas they're in charge of. Okay? Because, again, everything's compartmentalized, so the secretary handling visas to Cuba is not going to know anything about the intelligence officer's chain of command. It's just not going to happen. She's probably not even going to know that there's any intelligence officers there at all. Again, like I say, this story about this Nicaraguan who said he's sitting out there in the lobby and he sees this head of the intelligence, the murder division of the Cuban intelligence, handing Oswald money is just full of shit. I don't buy it at all. Okay? Anyway, so Phillips, if you read and understand what he's saying, you figure out really quickly what Oswald's role was. He was a barrel bomb. He was an instigator. He may not have known what his job was, okay? He was just doing an assignment that he was getting money for, and that's all he knew. Okay? He was doing his patriotic duty. Anyway, we'll keep going. It says, now, that you say intercept telephone conversations, were there wiretaps in the Cuban consul and embassy offices? There were, sir. You see how he's really short about that. And who was it that maintained those taps? Was it your operation? It was not my operation. It was an outside operation. So they've got multiple different, compartmentalized people that are doing different things. You got one group over here that's tapping and translating the phone calls. You got another group in the NSA up in Maryland that are monitoring the telex and the satellite communications. Okay? You got another group that's handling the moles. You got another group that's following, the different diplomatic embassy personnel and assessing them, okay? You got another group that's actually trying to turn agents inside the embassy. So all this would be separate from what he was doing. He may be brought in on some things, but other things maybe not. All right, it says, now, when you say outside operation, you mean another assignment area of the CIA, another physical area outside the U.S. Embassy. It was in this suburb, like in North Mexico City, I believe is what I found out. And who was it in charge of that particular area? I believe the senior man in charge of, I'm surprised he even knows, was the name of Redacted. Of course, in the discussing this with your staff last night, I remembered Redacted, but now I remember the full name was Redacted. So apparently that guy is still alive, or was alive in 1976, and still doing the same type of operation. Mr. Sprague, and would you just explain to us the way in which the operation worked? Wow, that's interesting. This is methods and means here, folks, but anyway, we'll get into it. All right, sir. I never visited or saw it, but as I understood, telephone conversations were listened to. There was some selection there because there were so many phones in the embassy, and the attempt to get them on the important lines, the ones where the most information would be available. Again, this is why you're gonna send in barrel bomb Oswald. So you get these telexes and phone conversations going, and then from that information you know who to watch the most. Okay? So you're not going to be watching or listening to some secretary, who's typing up visas to Havana, her phone conversations with her boyfriend. You're not going to monitor that. You're going to be looking for the guy who's the head of the intelligence and counter-espionage in the embassy. And you're going to monitor his phone and his telexes. Okay? There was some selection there because there were so many phones in the embassy in an attempt to get them on the important lines, the ones that are most information would be available. They were listened to and put on tape. Some would have responsibility of listening to that and deciding whether it was worth putting into a transcript. That is, if there was a telephone call about someone asking whether the wife about shopping, there you go, that might be something that would not be on there. But if it was anything that might be interesting, i.e. like, hey, we had just had this crazy guy, his name is Oswald, he said he lived in Russia, and he's trying to get a visa into Cuba to get into Russia. You're going to monitor that person's phone calls and telexes quite actively. Now, it's much different today, but just from watching movies and reading books, there were many different lines of communication. They had letters that went out, regular mail, okay, and no intelligence information would be in that. That would be a letter going back to someone in Mexico saying your visa has been approved or this is your visa or whatever. coming out from the embassy. You'd have mail going through the diplomatic pouch, okay, the secure diplomatic pouch that the Cubans would be in control of. Inside that diplomatic pouch would be intelligence information separate from just the diplomatic cables or whatever, or correspondence. You'd have some kind of telex machine, which is basically just a regular telex machine to send non-secure communication, diplomatic communication back and forth, like, hey, the, I don't know, the electric bill this month was $20 more than it usually was, and we need someone to come down and check out why our electric bill went up, or something, some crap like that. Then you're going to have this coded, encrypted telex machine in a secure room, okay, that's locked off from everybody else. Only need to know. Only intelligence officers are going to have that. And that's going to be secure communication. It's going to go through the telephone lines. It's going to go through some kind of microwave dish radio communications, or it's going to go, nowadays they pop back. Even back then, I think they might have sent it up to a satellite, okay? And then you'd have the NSA working on those, trying to break the encryption codes to be able to read the traffic. Now, whether they were or were not, I don't know, and I doubt Mr. Phillips would ever give up that information, whether it was done or not. Then there's telephone communication, okay? You're going to have, hold on one second. You're going to have regular telephone communication going back and forth. You may have some guy there that's a guard, or some guy there that's a diplomat calling his wife saying, hey, honey, I'm going to be on vacation, and I'm coming back on the 23rd or whatever, and I'll be at the airport at this date. You may have that, and then you may have encrypted telephone scrambler communication on a scrambled telephone for immediate, not used a lot, but for immediate emergencies, that, hey, there's a bomb, or hey, there's something that needs to be taken care of immediately, going back to, Moscow or Havana, whatever, whatever it is. And then eventually they get into, computer communication. I doubt there was any kind of ARPANET type communications that the Russians had through computers. There might have been some kind of early pretext of or something like an email, but I doubt it in 1963. And that would probably be secured and scrambled and all kinds of stuff. So that's what he's talking about. They're going to be monitoring all that. They're going to have different groups monitoring all that, and he may be briefed on those things. Again, you're not going to have everybody knowing everything. That's why I always have a problem with these intelligence people that say they were in, former intelligence officers, or say they were former CIA, and they just happen to know everything. It's just impossible. Absolutely impossible. Anyway. All right, go ahead. Otherwise, a transcription was made, which was an effort to reproduce word for word what had been on that tape. The transcription then came into the station in the case of the Cuban embassy in Spanish. And who was it that would make the decision in a particular area, or to transcribe a conversation or not? And I would say anything they even thought a hint of that related to something of intelligence value, they would transcribe, because I've seen FBI memos and I've seen long, detailed CIA memos on just absolute bullshit about, cigars that people smoked and hats that people wore and crap like that just didn't really make a lot of sense. So, and another thing too, if you want to think about it this way, okay, so you're working a CIA station, say, in some faraway place like Ecuador or Swaziland in Africa, okay? And so you've got to justify the budget that goes to giving you that assignment and that job, and hope that, eventually if you do good there, they'll move you up the ladder into some other more important or more interesting station. Okay? So you're going to try to generate as much traffic as possible, okay, to justify the expense of keeping you there or having you there, and to recognize, to get your recognition, I guess you could say. This is kind of the ego going in here that, hey, that Bob down in Swaziland, boy, he really comes across a lot of shit, and he's got daily good stuff coming in. Okay? Yeah, let's bring, his assignment ends there in June. Let's bring him up in July, and we'll move him to the East German embassy for the U.S. there, and, so that's how those things work. You want to recognize, you want people to recognize you, so you move up the chain. Okay, so that's a lot of this traffic comes that's just totally ridiculous, unnecessary, but it's a lot of people wanting to move up the chain of command, so they generate paper to get recognized. Anyway, so it says, and who is it that would make the decision in a particular area whether to transcribe a conversation or not? The person in that outside unit or persons there in the outside unit, I don't know because I didn't visit it and I didn't know people who were working there. Approximately how many people were on that assignment? I don't have any idea. I would guess a dozen, but I really don't know. Do you know the names of any of the people who were involved in the assignment? Yeah, I very much doubt that he would know that, okay? And there's another good reason for that, okay? What if one day Mr. Phillips gets blackmailed or captured by the enemy intelligence? The more he knows, the more exposure and danger he puts to other people. So the less he knows, the better off it is. Okay? The more secure those people's assignments are. Because once you get burnt, that's it. They got your name. You can't be used again. That's one of the reasons they, only on a need-to-know basis. Did you not tell us last night the names of some other people? I mentioned the name of Mrs. Ann Goodpasture, an officer in the station, and the name of Mr. Redacted. And were they connected with that assignment? That is true, sir. Well, why did you just not say you didn't know anybody else? I'm sorry, sir. I thought you meant in the something itself. Well, that is our connection with this what is their connection with this particular unit? All right, so we're going to stop there, and we're going to move on to another section here.
Images that are captured in that poetry of the United States.
Into this interior chamber, it had no windows in it, and they would lock us in.
Because whenever the FBI or police came by, they weren't going to admit that they knew whomever it was they were looking for. So Bob had to have me visit New York City, talk to my friends and neighbors, and tell them it was okay to talk.
All right. Oh, sorry. So it's still running there. So I kind of forgot where I was there. So I'm just going to start about right here because that sounds familiar. But again, this is this is Edwin Lopez and Dan Hardaway, and they talk about they were basically assigned to the CIA in Langley from the House Assassinations Committee, and they would request records, okay, and eventually they got moved away from the CIA office in Langley because they were digging too deep according to what the CIA wanted. So then they were moved back to some other building, and then they had their go-between is this George Joannidis, okay, who they weren't advised that he is deeply involved in the Cuban anti-Castro Cuban operation down in. He was the head of that station, JM Wave, like Phillips was the head of the anti-Cuban operations in Mexico City. George Joannidis is basically the equivalent of that in Miami, but also the head of anti-Cuban operations, anti-Castro operations. So basically he was assigning people to go out, these mercenaries, these Cubans, to go out and attack Cuba. And he was giving them assignments and money and weapons and things like that. But George Joannidis is now, 10, 15 years later, is working as a blocking agent, okay, for the House Select Committee that's requesting documents through him. So it's sort of like, if you're investigating someone, if you're investigating the mob, okay, but you're limited on the documents you can get on the mob, and the mob assigns someone from the mob for you to, as a liaison, to get documents on the mob about. It's sort of the same thing. Anyway, here we go.
People in suits.
Well, we won't talk about the other reasons why you had troubles, and I ain't gonna say anything about why I did. But the thing you have to understand is, and people have asked me this also, well, why do you think the CIA agreed to give you guys unexpurgated access? I think they seriously underestimated us. Mm-hmm. I think they thought they had Bob in their pocket. They thought that me and Eddie were wet behind the ears law school students who would not, in a matter of 18 months, be able to master anything or much of anything. And once we got in there, they assigned clerks. We had an office at the CIA for about 9 months. And we reported to work every morning in Langley. And they would have an escort who would take us from the front of the building into this interior chamber. It had no windows in it. And they would lock us in. And then our contact would be a CIA employee. Initially, it was Regis Blahut. And then after Regis got transferred down to the CIA, or to the committee offices, it was 2 other clerk-type people who would come in and bring us the files that we were asking for. And the type of access that we had was we would sit there and we would read files. And our main brief was Mexico City, but we had Bob's agreement that as long as we were getting our work done in Mexico City, we could ask for anything we wanted to. We were asking for stuff on Mitch Warbell. We were asking for stuff on Bill Harvey. We were asking for stuff on QJ Wynn. We were investigating every possibility that we could think of that we'd seen in the critical literature. And we're trying to do, and we were doing it all at one time.
And so what they're doing is kind of an earlier version of what I've been doing here. So as I go through, documents, okay, and it can be a real rabbit hole sometimes. I'll go through documents and then, I'll just start pulling names. Well, who the hell is William Godot? Okay, and who the hell is Robert Temper? And I'll just start pulling names, and then I'll put up an extra tab here and type in Robert Tipper, JFK assassination, and then I'll go through and go in. Eventually, after I finish all these other documents, I'll just keep working my way to the right, and I'll go in and go 5, 10 Google pages deep sometimes and looking for PDFs or other interesting documents. I try to stay away from forums and websites and crap like that, because that's just other people's opinions. I want direct sources. And then I'll go through those documents and I'll look through and I'll look at names, and then boom, like, you know, who's this person and who's that person, and I'll just go through hundreds, and then I'll take all those, you know, one at a time documents, I'll read it, try to figure out where it fits in the assassination, either before the assassination, either after the assassination. Where does that person fit, or first come into the assassination, okay? And then I'll go and put all those documents there, and eventually I've got this long, extremely long timeline, probably a 50-year timeline here it's going to take to get through everything. But it's important because it helps you understand what exactly is going through. And I try to stay away from, you know, CIA stuff and FBI stuff and anything that doesn't have anything to do with the assassination or the Cubans that are involved in the assassination. I stay away from that because you could just really get lost. But this is what I'm doing, and, you know, that's what he's talking about, what he's doing. They're fishing. They're looking at documents, and then they're taking names from those documents and requesting documents on those names. And that's how you start putting things together. Anyway, we'll keep going.
So that there wasn't necessarily a clear pattern that was emerging from what we were asking for. And we weren't required to ask in writing, so there wasn't a permanent record trail of what we were asking for either. If you read about when they bring Joanides in, their main justification was to create a paper trail of what we were requesting. And the way it would work is I would read a file and I'd see a reference to this operation or to this file.
There you go. Exactly. Exactly what I'm doing.
I want this file. And then within a day or two, I would have that file. And I was getting it pretty much, most of it, as far as I could tell, unexpurgated with no deletions. And we were...
So this is exactly what I'm doing, although they don't have the internet back then. He's sitting there requesting it directly from the CIA. This is before, you know, the Records Review Board. Thank God we've got hundreds of assassination researchers out there that have done the hard work for me and gone to the different archives, the National Archives, researched, found these documents, made copies, and then put them online. Okay? Thank God for Weisberg. Thank God for Mary Farrell. Thank God for History Matters. All these groups. You know, all I'm doing is just Googling them. I'm sure there's probably 2 to 3 times more documents out there that's not coming up on Google. And then on top of that, there's probably 2 to 300 or 2 to 3 times more documents on that have never been publicly released and probably been destroyed. So he's doing essentially what I was doing, although he's sitting at a desk in an office in the CIA.
We're getting great access to great stuff. And consequently, we told Bob we were happy with that. And initially, the CIA was cooperating. We had no reason to think that they weren't. When we started pushing, and at this point, I think this was mainly me that started pushing on investigating the disinformation efforts after the assassination, and realizing that I could tie just about every single disinformation effort directly back to David Phillips, that George Joanides gets involved.
See, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I just want to show you something here. So, okay. So when I do a listing, I put it in by the first time this person shows up on the date. 23 September 1963, Chief of Cuban Operations David Atlee Phillips, Maurice Bishop, was made the CIA's Chief of Cuban Operations and in Mexico City. And so I Google David Atlee Phillips, comma, JFK assassination. Then I do another Google search, Maurice Bishop, comma, JFK assassination. And so with this guy, I actually went about 10 pages deep on each search into Google, which is not a lot, but sometimes some of these listings won't even have 3 or 4 pages. And I'm sure there's better ways, there's even better engines of finding information, but I'm just using Google because, like I said, I don't want to go down too far of a rabbit hole because I'll never get out, you know. But one thing I noticed, so here I'll show you the difference. Let me see here. So we'll go up to George Godot. Okay. So you see George Godot. Okay. That's his listing. There's his find a grave. This is another file here. I didn't get a date on this one. But you see here, 1968. This is, I believe, an FBI file. And this is from the House Select Committee here. And then if you go back on these other listings here. Well, anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that every single person involved whose name pops up with the JFK assassination, either the paper starts off with an FBI statement or a Warren Commission statement from 1963, 1964, or there's a CIA memo from 1963, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68 with Garrison's investigation, and then they get into the House Select Committee papers in 75, 76, 77, like that. Okay? That's what you find. But when you look at David Atlee Phillips, there's absolutely no documents in the National Archives that anyone is finding until the House Select Committee brings David Atlee Phillips to testify in 1976. There's nothing. Okay? And which is very bizarre. Because like I said, I've got FBI memos with George Godot going back 1963. I've got, anyone involved in the assassination or anyone ever questioned by the FBI, the CIA, the CIA mentioned, we got this Moroccan student from the day after, 2 days after, or the day after Oswald was assassinated, saying he met Marina, and there's an CIA memo coming from West Berlin mentioning his story. But David Atlee Phillips is absolutely nothing, even though he was involved in the Mexico City Cuban operations. There's nothing. No documents online whatsoever. And why is that? Well, maybe they just haven't found anything, right? Or it could be that if he was in charge of the Cuban operations in Mexico City, maybe he'd either destroyed or securely stored all the memos related to that. But it goes even more than that, because there's going to, it's going to be memos he's going to be sending out, but there's also going to be memos mentioning him. And there's nothing. Which is very, 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 very strange. So that tells you one thing. That David Atlee Phillips, to me, this is what it tells me, was so essentially involved in the assassination that people in the CIA and the FBI sought and found it necessary to go in and remove any references to him involved in the Mexico City operations, the wiretapping, anything involving Oswald. He's not mentioned. It's all been removed or destroyed. So what that tells you is that David Atlee Phillips was playing defense on one side, pulling everything that shows he may be involved, probably ahead of time. And then that the CIA, the FBI are playing defense by trying to disassociate their organization from the assassination by going in and removing the memos on their end. So you got two ends. You got David Atlee Phillips at the Mexico City station removing documents. And then you've got CIA, FBI removing any kind of documents mentioning him. Okay. It doesn't make any sense. And I'm going to show you how it doesn't make any sense, because we get into this British guy. Okay. Let's see. Hold on. See if I can find his name here. Yeah, John Howard Bowen. Albert Alexander Osborne. And there's memo after memo after memo after memo from the FBI and the CIA of this nobody, this minister, this preacher, scam artist that sat by Oswald from Laredo, on the bus from Laredo to Mexico City. But yet the FBI, not only do they spend probably thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, they even had, Scotland Yard interview his sister and brother in England. So they're spending thousands and thousands of dollars and months and months and months of sending out agents all over the country, New Orleans, Texas, Tennessee, Ohio. They interview his sister, or a sister or ex-wife or something like that, all over the country for this nobody, and then they drop the case at the end saying that, oh, it was just a coincidence. But they spent over 6 months, 7 months, thousands of man-hours, thousands of dollars investigating this nobody, churning out lots of paper on this guy. And I'm going to read through all this when we finally get down to here. But it's just unbelievable how much time they spent on this guy, who they eventually just, at the end, just drop the case and say, oh, hey, probably it was just coincidence. Maybe he was, sitting by Oswald, and I don't think it's coincidence. They don't think it was coincidence. The FBI is not going to waste their time and their money and their agents with something that they think is just doesn't make any sense. But yet, we've got David Atlee Phillips essentially involved in the anti-Cuban operations in Mexico City, where Oswald was at. There's no memos coming up online at all. I'm not finding anything. Maybe someone has found an archive out there of memos about him before, November 27, 1976. But I'm not finding it. If you have it, please send it to me. I would love to read it. But that tells you something right there. That if they're going to spend all this time and memos and money and man-hours following a nobody lead like Osborne, but then there's nothing about David Atlee Phillips. There's not even an FBI memo of them ever interviewing him. Did you hear the tapes of Oswald? Did you see the photos of Oswald? Nothing. I mean, how could they not? Because he's monitoring the Cuban embassy. That's his job. Okay? He's in charge of monitoring their intelligence people. Okay? And yet we have this memo in the FBI about this Nicaraguan who says he saw Oswald inside the Cuban embassy with the head of this redhead Negro Cuban intelligence officer who's the head of the Assassinations Bureau of the Cuban intelligence, handing Oswald money and information. But they don't go and talk, the FBI doesn't go and talk to David Atlee Phillips? There's no memo of that? Why not? That's the guy that's in the charge of the Cuban operations. If anybody, he could confirm or deny this story or have some information about it. But no, there's no memos on it whatsoever. Anyway, we'll keep going along with this video here.
And George Joanides, the first thing he does is he shuts our office in the CIA. And the new arrangement is that we will work out of the headquarters building of the committee, and that we will be required to formally request everything we want to see.
There you go.
And that it will be provided to us in a safe room at our headquarters. And the alleged reason was so that they could keep an accurate record of what we were asking for.
You see, the reason they want an accurate record of every single memo, okay, or every single search term, so they can go and clean out, George Ioannidis can go in and clean out any derogatory information like about Phillips or about him or about anything related to the assassination involving the CIA or CIA contractors, and sanitize that, okay? Instead of them just going in like kids and pulling whatever directly from the files, now they're going to sanitize it. This is the protection that's going on 15 years later. And again, you got to ask yourself, why would people care in the CIA if they didn't do anything 15 years later? Why would they care about protecting the rogue elements of the CIA and the FBI that were involved in the assassination? Okay? Because at this time, they're curtailing the power of the FBI, they're curtailing the power of the CIA, and they're trying to save their organization out of fear from being destroyed and from being implicated in the assassination. Oh, it was your rogue agents that went off the farm and killed our president. So therefore, you have no control of your own agents or your organization. So therefore, we're going to curtail your power and your budget and your operations, and then we're going to bring you under control of some congressional committee or oversight committee that's going to individually look at every single operation before it occurs. This is what the CIA, this is why the CIA is doing this, to protect their own current operations then and in the future. It's exactly what's going on. Okay? And also George Ioannidis, he was involved in Jamwave, and a lot of the Cubans that are involved in the assassination were under his belt, so he's trying to protect his own ass and his pension. Because eventually he's going to retire, okay? And if you've been convicted of killing the President of the United States and you're a convicted felon, your mortgage, your income, your retirement is going to be in serious jeopardy, okay?
And what we had seen. What it was they were able to slow us down and shut us off from anything really significant that we were looking for. And I go into some of the details in that in the presentation that I did in Pittsburgh, which again, I don't want to repeat because I want to go one step further here today. And I want to offer some views and expand a little bit on, if you download the written presentation of those Pittsburgh remarks, I'm expanding on what I said in footnote 30 of that paper. But what I want to talk to you about is what possibly were they keeping from us? What was it that I had found that they were concerned that I could dig deeper into?
Yep.
And this was not apparent to me at the time because I didn't know about Ioannidis. It's only through the work of Jeff Morley and through the work of Dr. John Newman that I've been able to put together what it was that I had that was so significant from their perspective.
And this is one thing I've mentioned indirectly all the time, is that this is why I'm not advocating that, hey, I know everything and this is what it is and here's the evidence that proves why I know everything and how it happened and I know who's involved and everything and this is my presentation. This is not what these videos are. These videos are a learning process. I'm learning stuff every day, making connections. This is why I ramble on about all these different connections and how these things relate is because, with time comes wisdom. And, the one thing you may be here but not realize that the connections that you're coming across right there, until you come across this, you come across that document, you come across this document, and then later on you look back and you go, oh shit, that's why they were acting like that. You see? So that's why whenever you go anywhere, you can't just run around saying, hey, I've got all the answers and this is the way it is, and just look, like, they take that horse and they put the blinders on, with the blinders on, and just look in one direction and say, I know everything and this is the way it is, and here we're going to prove it, and I'm going to show you the documents. Because if you do, you miss all the other things that may be around you. And then when you look back, it's too late. People are dead. Documents are gone. You're not in that same position anymore. But this is why you have to literally, walk around like that little kid in the Willy Wonka factory, just looking around amazed, but taking in everything, like that movie, everything, everywhere, all at once. Unfortunately, that you have to keep your eyes open. You have to keep making connections, and know that some connections that you make here may be different, and you may have changed those connections. And just because you made a connection here that turned out to not be correct doesn't mean you can never make connections later on. That's bullshit, because you may not have had the information back here that you have here 20 years later. This is what he's talking about. With age comes wisdom. And again, even here, you may make connections and conclusions that 20 years later may change or modify. That's usually what happens, is things don't really completely 180 change. They go from 180 to 160 or 120 change, like that. That's how real changes come about.
That I didn't see at the time as being as significant as it was. I knew it was significant, but not near as significant as it is become apparent in light of the other facts that have come out. Here's what we know. David Phillips recruited the leadership of the DRE while he was serving in Havana in the 1950s, and was the DRE's first case officer. At the time it was known as the DR, and it was in Cuba. When the DRE leadership fled Cuba in 1960, a guy named William Kent, a case officer in Miami, became the DRE's first case officer in the United States and organized them into an effective organization. After moving from Cuba to headquarters, David Phillips became responsible for some of the early disinformation operations aimed at the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He designed the first anti-Fair Play for Cuba Committee operation. That was David Phillips that did that.
You see, this is why Oswald is connected with David Atlee Phillips, because what is Oswald doing? He's playing as a fake member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, passing out flyers to try to recruit people so they can use, Bannister's going to report these people and they can monitor them. And then that operation being run by David Atlee Phillips. David Atlee Phillips, when Oswald leaves Mexico, or leaves New Orleans, is made head of Cuban operations in Mexico City. Oswald goes to Mexico City. He's seen in Dallas with David Atlee Phillips by Veciana. So, again, all these memos that show anything about David Atlee Phillips, or mentioning David Atlee Phillips, or investigating David Atlee Phillips, are all gone. They're all disappeared. There's a good reason for that.
In the Bay of Pigs, Phillips was in charge of anti-Castro propaganda operations at headquarters. As such, he worked closely with a guy he called Doug Gupton at JM Wave. Doug Gupton was William Kent. Phillips described their working relationship as being very close. Gupton wasn't a registered pseudonym, but was rather a cover name that Kent, the true officer's true name, used in the field. It is very likely that William Kent, Doug Gupton's registered pseudonym in 1963 was Robert K. Truchard. Phillips' work on Cuban disinformation continued after his transfer to Mexico City in 1961 until he left Mexico City in 1965. In the fall of 1962, George Joanides was handpicked by Richard Helms. Remember, Helms promised the Secretary General of DRE that he'd have a personal representative. Joanides was handpicked by Helms. Joanides was part of what was known in the CIA as the Greek Mafia that came out of the Greek operations in the late 1940s and was directly tied into Thomas Karamessine's and Richard Helms through personal loyalties as well as professional relationships extending back into the late 1940s. He was handpicked by Helms to replace Ross Crozier as the DRE case officer in Miami after the DRE's public opposition to the policies of the government during the October 1962 missile crisis. Joanides reported directly to Richard Helms.
Wow.
Joanides' registered pseudonym was Walter D. Newby. His supervisor was Robert K. Truchard. William Kent, Doug Gupton, who was very close to David Allen Phillips. Up to 90% of the DRE's funds came from the CIA. The Assassination Records Review Board managed to force the CIA to declassify a few of Joanides' reports. Now, I'm not getting into the footnoted information that's in my presentation. This presentation, the written version of it, will be up on the...
Okay, we're going to stop there. So, let's just remind yourself of something, okay? So, through Operation Mongoose, Robert Kennedy took over, or tried to take over, a lot of these anti-Castro operations. So they were already running anti-Castro assassination, anti-Cuban operations before Kennedy was elected. Kennedy came into power. They tried to, push the Bay of Pigs thing on him. That didn't work out. Kennedy fired Dulles. Put out this memo saying that the Joint Chiefs would be responsible to oversee the CIA operations. The CIA was trying to basically run its own independent operations. The president was trying to control these operations. And so this was a struggle between, the CIA was basically allowed to do what it wanted under Eisenhower. Okay, and then, Nixon was running a lot of those operations through Operation 40, okay, but when there's this power struggle going on between the CIA and the president, and these idiot people that run around saying the CIA was not involved in the assassination in no way of the President of the United States are just delusional, or they're propagandists for the CIA. There's all this conflict. When they say there's a lot of smoke, there's probably a fire there. There was a lot of smoke between Kennedy and the CIA. I'm not saying that Richard Helms was directly involved, but you see just right here, you got George Joanides, Maurice Bishop, they're all reporting to Richard Helms, so how could he not know about what was going on? So, the whole point is, I'll give you the timeline, basically, after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy tried to take over the anti-Cuban, anti-Castro operation through Robert Kennedy. Operation Mongoose, a little bit of success, not a lot of success. Then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is one of the reasons why, before you had the Cubans, you had the Mafia, maybe a few people in the CIA that didn't like Kennedy and wanted to kill him, but they just didn't have the power to do it, okay? What really happened, this is what my research is telling me here, the worm really turned after the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, even the military and the upper heads of the CIA and the rest of the people in the defense industry just really thought that they tried to push Kennedy into invading Cuba. He didn't do it because he saw that there'd be a lot of dead people in with a nuclear war. He did the sensible thing, but they thought that he had sold out America. They had their one opportunity to get the missiles and get, to change Cuba, and they didn't. And so that's when I believe the hardcore right-wing people in the military, in the government, the FBI, the CIA, all stepped on board onto the assassination train. There was always this, fire brewing down below, but never got to be very big because they just didn't have the capability of doing it. But that's when the military and the heads of the CIA, or the further up the chain of the CIA, came into operation, and they used these disenfranchised people, the Cuban, anti-Castro Cubans, the white mercenaries, the same organization of Operation Mongoose that were trying to get Kennedy, or trying to get Castro, they turned it onto Kennedy. Okay? And this is why I believe that his brother he was Attorney General, didn't push for an investigation because it would expose that Kennedy was trying to kill Castro, and then somehow this operation got out of hand and got turned on him and ended up killing Kennedy, which a lot of people have said this. I'm not the first. But this seems to be what happened, is that, yes, as an organization, the FBI, and as an organization, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agencies, the Secret Service, didn't all collude together. The very head tops of the, these people, organizations, didn't all collude together to kill the president. There were rogue elements using the structure, the infrastructure, the money, the financing, the facilities of those organizations that were trying to kill Castro, and they just turned it and killed the president. Okay? It's very obvious that's exactly what happened. Okay? And then they use that mechanism to cover that up, and then the people that weren't in with the organization, I guess you could say, either they found out that their organization or agency was used to kill the president, and they didn't want to be blamed for not controlling their people in their organization, so therefore they covered it up, or they were afraid that the blowback from all of this would come back and destroy their organization. And many of them believe that, yeah, it's bad the president died, but if the CIA is destroyed and scattered to the wind, or if the FBI is destroyed and dismantled and scattered to the wind, much worse could happen. Okay? Much worse. It's like in that movie Alexander, when King Philip is talking to his son and talking about, the gods and how men fear the gods. But they don't just fear the gods, they fear if the gods were taken away and destroyed, worse. They fear worse, the Titans. Okay? And so what I mean is that the CIA, the FBI, even though they found out, they probably did an internal investigation and found out that rogue elements, right-wing rogue elements in their organization use their structure, use their facilities, use their money, use the organization to kill the President of the United States. That, yeah, it's bad. He's a nice guy. Maybe we didn't agree with him, but that's awful. But he's just one man. And if we go about basically falling on our sword in the CIA and the FBI and the Secret Service and the military intelligence, the NSA, if we all go about cleansing ourselves of these rogue elements and falling on our swords, the results could be much worse. The Soviets are very aggressive. They already tried to install missiles and attack us from Cuba. The resulting chaos because it would take 10, 20 years for all of the intelligence to recover, could be much, much worse than just the death of one rich Irish guy who happened to be the President of the United States. And that is the way they saw it. I'm sure this was explained to Johnson. I'm sure this was explained to Robert Kennedy. Yeah, we found out that rogue elements of our organization killed your brother. I can see this conversation. It's awful. We're trying to push these and cleanse this organization out. But if you go all out as Attorney General and start investigating and subpoenaing and questioning and jailing all these people, you're going to, because all these people are at different levels, essential levels of the organization, you're going to completely destroy our capabilities to defend ourselves against much worse. The communists, the Soviets, the Cubans. Don't worry, we'll get these guys, but you're going to have to give us time. And I think that's what he went on. He went on that belief that they would get them. And when they didn't, that's when he decided to run for president, and they decided that that was too dangerous. Have a revengeful Bobby Kennedy as president, tearing ass through the FBI and the CIA and the defense establishment on a vengeance because the assassination of his brother was just too much, and that's why they killed him. That's just my opinion. That's what I think happened. That's why I don't think, like I said, it's 2023 now. 1963, it's 60 years. Anyone that was 20 or 30 years old back then is 80, 90 years old now. What in God's name and why in God's name would anyone be protecting those people? And again, you have to look at it, they're not protecting those people. They're protecting the organization. Any director, any agent that's involved in the CIA, the FBI, the reason they would still be continuing the cover-up and still playing delaying tactics is to hope that all these people will be dead, and then they can come back maybe in 10 years and say, yeah, we knew it was rogue elements of the CIA, the FBI, and the military, but they're all dead now, and we tried to stop them, but we didn't know they were going to do it. And then once we found out, we tried to, protect the organization, to protect America. That's exactly what they're going to say. Our whole mission was, the president was dead, it was bad, but our whole mission was to protect America. You got to take yourself. I can see some congressional committee now, and some guy saying to a congressman, you got to take yourself back to the 60s and what we were facing. And it was horrible that the president's brains were scattered all over the backseat of that limousine, but we had bigger fish to fry. And we were thinking of the country, okay? And that's why we did what we did. Or that's why my grandfather did what he did. Or that's why my father did what he did. This is the way it's going to be. And whether it's 10, 20, 30 years from now, that's going to be the testimony right there. Anyway, we'll keep going on this line, but Mexico City is very important. I never realized how important Mexico City was, and so I started reading these documents and looking at the timeline, and then it all makes sense. And I'm sure 5, 10 years from now, I'm going to know even more. But we've just barely scratched the surface on Mexico City, and we've got a long ways to go. It's unfortunate that this generation, I'm talking about the people that are 15 to 25 years old, have about a 15 to 30 second, attention span. And that's not the way the world works. You can't solve all the problems of the world in a 30-second TikTok video. It takes a lot of in-depth reading, studying, learning, wisdom over time. It's not, I know the American way is, a 2.5-hour movie where Captain America fights the good fight and wins in the end. But that's not the way the real world works. In the real world, you fight, you lose. You fight, you lose. Hopefully you fight and you win more than you lose. But you keep fighting, and eventually the truth will come out. And I'll give an example, not about truth, but of fighting and winning. The Romans. If you look at a battle history of the Romans, you'll find out that in the beginning, when they had the Republic, they lost more than they won. The Celts sacked Rome when they were still a republic. Okay? Took everything in the city of value. But the Romans were persistent and didn't give up. They learned from their mistakes. If you look at their military, not one item in their inventory was invented by them. Their shield, their javelin, the gladius sword, their helmets, their marching, their pattern, their tactics of fighting, their siege machines, their recruitment of soldiers, their naval formations, their naval ways of fighting. Not one of them was invented. They didn't have one smart guy that said, hey, let's do this and let's try that. Not one of them. They learned by losing. Okay? Everything that the Romans are famous for nowadays, they got by losing. They got their asses kicked, and they learned from their enemies and adopted their enemy's strategy for the next fight. When someone beat them, they looked at how they were beaten, and they incorporated their enemy's weapons and strategy and tactics for the next fight. And then you see, over time, say this is a timeline here, and this is your wins, and this is your losses. Over time, they lost, but they were smart enough to learn from their losses. And that's what everyone has to do today. Because you're not always going to knock it out of the park. You're not always going to win everything, every day, every time. It's not a TikTok video. It's not a Captain American movie where you're going to know everything and be victorious from the beginning and just roll up the enemy. They're going to knock you down. They're going to knock you on your ass. And if you're smart, you'll learn from your enemy what they did and how they beat you. And then you'll apply that strategy that they used to beat you to beat them next time, or another enemy. And then what you find is over the timeline that the Romans, losses versus wins started to reverse, and they started to win more and more, and therefore they went from one city with a few 10,000 people to an empire of 30 to 60 million people that ruled the majority of the European and African population. That's how they won. And it's the same thing with the Kennedy assassination. It's the same thing with anything in life. You either adapt or die. Okay? Things are not always going to stay the same. Things are going to change. You know? Why don't we have newspapers all over the country now? There's still a few. They're all gone. And literally, in a matter of 10 years, they're all gone. Where's all the bookstores today? There's still a few, but the vast majority, all gone. Where's all the video stores? Hollywood Video and Blockbuster Video were some of the richest corporations of the 90s and 2000s. But new technology came along and wiped them out. Streaming, you know, Netflix. They used to mail. Netflix got really big because they would mail you the DVDs, and they had all these distribution centers set up across the country. They would mail out DVDs, you know, on your little list there. And I used to love getting the mail every day. Every other day I'd get a DVD from Netflix. I'd watch it that night, send it back, and then 2 days later I'd get another one. But they've drastically cut back. You can barely even find the DVDs anymore. I think it's almost impossible. And they do mostly streaming now. It's either adapt or die. Okay? And that's the same way with anything in life and the Kennedy assassination. If you stick to one conclusion and just basically ignore all the information that comes, the documents that come through that show it going in a different direction, you haven't learned anything, you're going to die. But you have to change, you have to, with every new document, you have to look at it fresh and then apply it to what you've learned so far and adapt that and then grow from that. And then the sky's the limit. You know, I'll give you one more example. The Macedonians under Alexander ruled from Greece all the way to India and down into Africa. And they had the phalanx, which is basically, you know, you have 4, 5, 6 rows of men with big shields and these long, I think they call alistas, these spikes that went out. It was like a pin cushion, and they would just smash into these Persian formations, and 30,000, you know, Macedonians could take on 100,000 Persians and completely destroy them. But the problem with the Macedonian phalanx is that it wasn't very maneuverable. It had to be on flat plains. If you got in rocky hills, they had problems. The Romans came along with their formation, their legions, and they had short swords with these javelin spears they could throw, and they were highly adaptable and maneuverable. And they came in and they fought the Macedonians and kicked their ass, because the Romans had learned from their enemies that had kicked their ass. And instead of lying around the ground kicking and screaming and crying and why us, they got themselves, they picked themselves up, they dusted themselves off, they looked at their dead bodies, they looked at the dead enemy soldiers and their weapons, and they adapted how they were beaten to become the victor. And then they used that technology over years, and they were able to beat the Macedonians. The Macedonians they were rigid in their phalanxes, weren't able to maneuver, and the Romans just wiped them out. They outmaneuvered them. Okay? So that's my last point there. Adapt or die. Every new document is just like a new battle for the Romans. You learn from it, apply it to what you already got, and see if it works. And not every technology is going to work. You know? Not everything's going to be a knockout of the park. But the main thing is to never give up, never ever get stubborn in your head where you think you know everything and there's nothing else that you can learn. I'm 56 years old, and I wish I was 20, because when I was 20 I knew everything and it was easy. But now I'm 56, I realize I don't know anything. I know some things, but every day is a new opportunity to learn something new. And I wish I had applied this back when I was in my 20s. But anyway, I'm going to stop here, and we're going to keep learning. We're going to keep moving forward, going to keep adapting. We're going to keep growing, and never, ever, ever get knocked on our ass and never get up, because you always have to get up. You're going to lose. You're going to get kicked down. You're going to get beaten down. But always get back up. Keep striving forward. Keep learning. And the sky's the limit. All right, take care.